Julian Hale, a professor of modern history at the University of Chesterfield, lived in a house on a quiet street that looked like a postcard from an old album. Clean white picket fences, manicured lawns, and perpetually smiling neighbors created the illusion of a perfect life. But Julian himself felt that his home was no longer a refuge for him. The loss of his wife left a deep emptiness, and every room reminded him of what he could never get back. He tried to resume a normal life, but the silence of the house emphasized his loneliness. This peace was broken when a new family moved in next door. The Riders, Grant, Elizabeth, and 2 children arrived with unexpected energy. Their van with their belongings stopped in front of the house at dawn, and by evening they had unpacked and thrown an impromptu party for the neighbors. Grant Ryder, a tall man with a penetrating gaze and a trademark smile, immediately became the life of the party. He hugged everyone, shook hands, and cracked jokes that made even the most reserved residents laugh. Elizabeth, his wife, was no less welcoming. Her calm voice and ability to make conversation immediately won the neighbors' affection. She brought homemade cookies and enthusiastically talked about how she and her children had long dreamed of a place like this to live. Their children, 2 teenagers, Lucas and Celine, quickly joined the youthful company on the street. Lucas, the eldest, was a master of jokes and always kept everyone in a good mood, while Celine, a shy girl with a book in her hand, immediately became friends with the neighbor's daughter, Emmy. At first glance, the Ryders seemed to be the embodiment of the American dream. But Julian felt something inexplicable. He couldn't explain it rationally, but their perfection seemed artificial. Grant was too friendly, his jokes sounded too prepared, and his smile was almost rehearsed. Julian caught himself thinking that he was annoyed by how easily the Ryders blended into street life, as if they knew how to do it in advance. The first incident that raised alarms occurred a few days later. Julian, who was in the habit of working late in his office by the window, noticed a large van pull into the Ryder yard under the cover of night. 2 men in dark clothes got out and began carrying heavy boxes into the garage. Their movements were quick, almost nervous, as if they were trying to avoid prying eyes. The garage, which was usually locked, was now illuminated by a faint light seeping through the windows. Julian thought that perhaps it was the remnants of their move, but an uneasy feeling did not leave him. The next day, while walking down the street, he saw Grant discussing something with the same man in the van. Their conversation stopped as soon as Julian came into view. The Ryders gave no reason for suspicion. They invited neighbors to barbecues, participated in local charity events, and were always smiling. But it was this impeccability that began to seem burdensome to Julian. Something in their behavior made him wary, as if they were playing roles in a play, carefully considering each line. He tried to push his doubts aside, but the fog of unease gradually enveloped his thoughts, and Julian realized that simply watching these people and hoping for the best would not work. Julian Hale tried to suppress his suspicions about the Ryders, but the more he watched, the deeper he plunged into the tangle of mysteries that seemed to hide the walls of the neighboring house. His curiosity turned into an obsessive need to find answers, especially after several unusual events. One morning, on his way back from a lecture at the university, Julian saw Grant standing in the yard with his phone in his hand. His face was tense and his hand was shaking. Julian noticed that Grant kept looking around, as if he was afraid someone was watching him. He was saying something into the phone, but his voice was barely audible. After a few minutes, he abruptly hung up and quickly walked into the house. This scene left Julian with the feeling that Grant was hiding something more than just family troubles. Under the pretext of a friendly visit, Julian decided to pay the Ryders a visit. He brought a bottle of wine, hoping it would give him a better look at what was going on inside their home. Elizabeth greeted him at the door with a happy smile, but her eyes betrayed anxiety. Julian tried to act casual, but every little thing in the house caught his attention. There was a large table in the living room, piled high with papers. Julian involuntarily glanced at the papers and noticed the building plans and some markings made with a red marker. When Elizabeth noticed that he was looking at the table, she quickly covered the papers with a newspaper and tried to change the subject. "We haven't had time to organize after the move," she said, smiling. "You know how it is, so much stuff piles up." But Julian felt that this smile was a bit of a stretch. He decided to stay a little longer, hoping to learn more. During dinner, Grant tried to appear relaxed, but Julian noticed that he was carefully avoiding certain topics. When it came to Grant's job, He briefly said that he was working on security projects, and quickly turned the conversation to sports. After leaving the house, Julian felt that his worries were not unfounded. He started looking for information about the writers on the internet. After several hours of research, he managed to find an old article that mentioned Grant's name. The article talked about his possible involvement in a radical organization that was preparing anti-government actions. Although the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, Grant's name remained on the list of suspects. Julian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. His doubts only grew stronger when he noticed unfamiliar cars pulling up to the Ryder house at night. The people who got out of them would enter the garage and leave the house a few hours later. It looked as if some secret meetings were taking place in the garage. One day, Julian noticed a faint light seeping through the garage window. He came closer and heard snatches of conversation. The words "operation," "point of influence," and "red zone" sounded so distinct that his heart fluttered. At home, he began to analyze everything he had seen and heard again. He put the puzzles together, but felt that he was missing key elements. Julian realized he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't stop. The raiders became a puzzle for him that he had to solve, even if it cost him his peace of mind or perhaps something more. Julian Hale was stumped. He had more and more evidence that something was wrong with the Ryder family, but each new step he took toward the solution opened up even more questions. His suspicions began to turn into an obsession when he decided to do something he had previously thought impossible: trespass on his neighbor's property. One moonless night, when the street was plunged into silence, he took a flashlight and a small notebook and climbed over the fence separating his yard from the Ryders. The garage, which was always locked, seemed to be the key to everything. Its metal door glistened slightly in the light of the street lamp. Julian noticed that one of them was slightly ajar. He carefully lifted the edge and peered inside. The space he saw looked like a miniature command center. A computer with a large screen was on the table, and maps, images of buildings, and printed diagrams with red markings hung on the walls. His eyes rested on a large map of the city of Chesterfield that took up almost half the wall. It had several points circled in red. In the center stood out the town square, marked as the Red Zone. Next to the map was a printout with the date, April 15th, Day of Truth. Julian felt his heart sink. It was already 2 weeks away. There were many more boxes in the garage. On one of them was the inscription, "Chemical Components." Caution. Julian realized that it was too risky to open it, but other little things caught his attention: syringes, cables, and small devices that could be parts of explosives. His heart was beating loudly. He knew he was in the middle of something dangerous, but he couldn't leave without finding out more. He took a few photos with his phone and was about to leave when he heard something crash at the entrance. Julian immediately turned off his flashlight and crouched down at the table. 2 men entered the garage, one of them Grant. "Everything ready?" Grant asked, looking around the room. "Almost. We're checking the communication system. There shouldn't be any glitches," replied the second man, whose voice sounded familiar to Julian. They continued talking, using terms Julian barely understood. Active point, synchronization, kill radius. Every word was full of menace. He tried to hold his breath as he heard Grant move closer to his hiding place. "Okay, we'll leave it here, but remember, no mistakes," Grant said, nodding toward the boxes. "We can't afford to blow this plan." Julian waited for them to leave. Only then did he quietly slip out of the garage, cross the yard, and return home. He could no longer ignore what was happening. Everything pointed to the fact that the Ryders were preparing a large-scale conspiracy. At home, he pulled out his phone and started looking through the pictures he had taken. They contained evidence that confirmed his suspicions. But what to do next? Go to the police? Risk not being taken seriously again? Julian knew that time was against him, and he decided to start by making a detailed plan of action. He spent the night researching on the internet. His hunch was confirmed. There had already been similar incidents involving radical groups in several cities across the country. Everything pointed to the fact that the Day of Truth could become a disaster like no one had ever seen before. Julian realized that he had no right to stop now. Julian Hale woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. He had enough evidence to suspect the Ryders of something serious, but not enough to convince others of his suspicions. He knew he had to proceed with caution, but he was growing increasingly isolated. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. Julian decided to go to the police, realizing that this might be his only chance. He gathered up his photos taken in the writer's garage and headed to the local police station. The officer taking his statement looked reserved and slightly skeptical. Julian described everything he saw in detail: maps, markings, boxes of chemicals, and snippets of conversations he overheard. "Do you realize that these are serious charges?" the officer asked, furrowing his brow. "Yes," Julian replied, "but I can't just sit back and let it go. If I'm wrong, prove it. Check their house, their garage." The officer wrote everything down in a report and said they would check it out. But when Julian left, he saw the officers shrugging their shoulders, discussing him behind his back. He resented that he was not taken seriously. It seemed that everyone around him remained blind to the danger. Julian returned home that day, but noticed that something had changed. There was a box on his doorstep. Inside was an empty envelope and a piece of paper with one word on it: "Stop." Although it was a subtle hint, Julian realized that he was being followed. He started checking all the windows and doors, closing the curtains and checking the locks. His paranoia grew, but he knew it wasn't just imagination. His life began to fall apart before his eyes. His colleagues at the university began to notice changes in his behavior. He was skipping lectures, becoming irritable, and hardly talking to his friends. Rumors of his strange suspicions spread quickly, and even his close friends began to avoid him. Julian felt isolated from the world, left alone with his anxieties. However, he could not afford to stop. Julian started searching the internet for information about the writers, their previous places of residence, and possible connections. But all of his attempts turned up only superficial details: perfect family photos, positive reviews from former neighbors, and records of charity work. It seemed that their lives were polished, like a showcase behind which a completely different reality was hidden. Meanwhile, Julian began to notice small but disturbing changes around him. The car that had always been parked on the neighborhood street was now permanently parked near his house. People he didn't know often strolled past his house, lingering at the windows. He felt that the raiders were turning against him. One evening Julian heard a knock on the door. Sensing danger, he picked up the phone and went to the door. Grant Ryder stood on the doorstep with the same relaxed smile. "Julian, long time no see," he said, holding up a bottle of wine. "Elizabeth and I thought you might be a little tired, so we thought we'd stop by." Julian held back from showing his tension. "I'm very busy," he replied briefly, "but thank you for your concern." Grant tilted his head slightly, as if to appraise Julian. "Of course, we won't keep you. But if you ever want to talk, you know where to find us." Julian closed the door, but his hands were shaking. He knew that this visit was a warning. The raiders were playing a game, and he felt that time was not on his side. But instead of stopping, Julian decided to fight. He was alone, but he was ready to do anything to thwart their plans. April 15th came sooner than Julian expected. Everything around him looked unusually calm, but it was deceptive. He knew that the raiders were preparing for something big. This day could change not only his life, but the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Julian decided not to wait and to act. His night was sleepless as he carefully studied the photos, printouts, and notes he had collected. His plan was risky, but there was no other way out. He focused on the town square, a place marked on a map in the Ryder garage as a red zone. Chesterfield's town square used to be the center of community life. Fairs, celebrations, and events were held there. But this morning, the square looked different. Julian arrived before the first vendors usually appeared. The streets around were strangely empty, with only a few people strolling around, oblivious to the small things. Julian noticed a few suspicious details: a van parked at the edge of the square, with dark windows. Next to it stood two men who were clearly trying not to attract attention. Their conversations were barely audible, but it seemed to Julian that they were waiting for a signal. He held his phone in his hand, ready to call the police. But his previous experience told him that relying on them alone was risky. Julian decided to act on his own. He approached the van, pretending to be a curious passerby, and tried to look inside. The tinted windows hid what was inside, but through a crack he saw boxes of wires and electronic components. His heart sank. These were explosive materials. Julian backed away and hid around the corner of the building, trying to stay calm. He dialed the police, But as he spoke, he realized that there was too little time left. He saw the riders, Grant and Elizabeth, approaching the square, dressed in normal clothes, but their faces betrayed tension. They were talking to the men near the van, handing them a file. "It's them," Julian whispered, pressing the phone to his ear. "The raiders. They're here, in the square. Hurry up." The police operator tried to reassure him, promising that a rapid response team was on its way. But Julian realized that every minute counted. He noticed Grant pulling a small device out of his pocket. It was a remote control. Without hesitation, Julian rushed to the square. His sudden appearance shocked Grant, but he quickly composed himself. "What are you doing, Julian?" Grant asked calmly, but his eyes betrayed fury. "You're the one who shouldn't be here," Julian replied, trying to buy time. "You think you can do this and get away with it?" Elizabeth tried to interject, but her words were drowned out by the sound of approaching sirens. Police surrounded the square, demanding that everyone stop. The riders exchanged quick glances, and Grant tried to press a button on the remote. But Julian rushed at him, knocking the device out of his hands. The struggle was short but fierce. The police intervened in time to arrest the riders and their accomplices. The explosives in the van were defused by the bomb squad, and Julian, though wounded in the fight, was relieved. He knew he had saved the city from disaster. After that day, Julian stood on the edge of the square for a long time, watching the police finish their work. He realized that his struggle had finally paid off. But deep down, he knew that this was just one battle in a war that would continue. The day of truth had passed, but the consequences of that day were just beginning to unfold. Julian Hale sat on a wooden bench in a park near his home, feeling every muscle in his body ache from the events on the square. But it was his mind that hurt the most, the realization that he had nearly lost everything fighting an invisible enemy. The raiders were arrested, but there was a feeling in the air that their plan was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Julian woke up to a loud knock on the door. The police had come to take him in for questioning. He realized that he would now become a key witness in a case that could possibly play out on a national scale. At the police station, he saw photos of himself, notes, and even surveillance footage that the police had collected after he had reported him. The investigating officer, Detective Lynch, looked at him intently across the desk. "You know you did an incredible thing," Lynch said, nodding at the evidence he had gathered, "but you also put your life in danger. The riders are no ordinary family. They're part of a network, and we still don't know how far back it goes." Julian sighed, trying to collect his thoughts. "I just couldn't stand by, knowing something was going on. If I couldn't stop them, I don't know if I could live with it." Lynch nodded, but his gaze remained serious. The raiders are only part of a larger game. Their plan in the square was prepared down to the last detail, and they clearly had help. "We found emails pointing to communication with people outside the country." The detective's words only confirmed what Julian had been feeling for a long time. The raiders were just a mask for a deeper conspiracy. Behind their friendly smiles and family-friendly facade was a cold-blooded organization ready to sacrifice everything for the sake of its ideals. After the interrogation, Julian returned home, but he did not find peace. His neighbors, who had recently considered him an eccentric, now looked at him with curiosity and respect. Some thanked him for saving the town, but Julian felt that this gratitude was superficial. Deep down, he knew they still didn't realize how close they were to disaster. In the evening, he received a call from Lynch. "We did some additional searching at the Ryder house," the detective said, "and we found something that will interest you. Can you come over?" When Julian arrived, Lynch showed him a secret room in the basement of the Ryder house that they hadn't noticed before. The walls of the room were covered with maps, photographs, and lists of names. In the center of the room was a table with a laptop running on a separate power source. On the screen was an electronic correspondence with instructions addressed to Grant Ryder. But what was most striking was that among the names on the walls was Julian Hale's. "They knew about you long before you suspected them," Lynch said. Julian felt a chill run down his spine. His name was circled in red, and there were dates and notes next to it, indicating that they planned to bring him into their plot, using his knowledge and connections. "They wanted me to be part of this," Julian whispered. "But why?" Lynch shrugged his shoulders. "We don't know that yet. But you interfered with their plan, and now they're behind bars. Although I doubt that's the end of it." Julian left the Ryder house feeling like he'd looked into the abyss. He had saved the city, but he was also at the center of a conspiracy whose scope had yet to be revealed. There was only one thought running through his mind. If the raiders were only the beginning, what was coming next? After the events in the town square, Julian Hale returned to his home, but now it seemed like a stranger. The street that had once been the embodiment of peace was now associated with lies and threats. The walls of his home no longer protected him from the outside world, but reminded him of the isolation he had experienced throughout the investigation. A wave of news about the prevention of the terrorist attack broke out in the press. The police and authorities were praised for their timely intervention, but Julian's name was hardly mentioned. Only a brief note noted his role in exposing the Ryders. It was unfair, but Julian wasn't looking for recognition. He knew he had made the right choice, and that was enough for him. In the weeks that followed, he watched as the Ryder home remained empty. The police confiscated the physical evidence, and the neighbors barely mentioned what had happened. It seemed that everyone was trying to forget the incident, as if a conspiracy of silence could erase the horrors of that day. Julian tried to return to his normal life, but it was harder than he thought. His lectures at the university went on as usual, but he noticed that his colleagues and students were cautious about him. His interest in conspiracies and terrorist groups no longer seemed like academic work, but a personal obsession. Rumors about his suspicions and the way he had been spying on the Ryders became a topic of discussion behind his back. One evening Julian decided to collect his thoughts and start writing a book. It was an opportunity to get everything he had been through out and at the same time warn others. His first lines were simple. Neighbors are a mirror that we are often afraid to look into. But sometimes, behind this mirror, there is something more than a reflection. He wrote at night, finding a kind of therapy in the process. Julian also tried to establish contact with some of his neighbors, but most avoided him. Only Mrs. Gardner, an elderly woman who lived across the street, once came to him with a pie and said, "You did what none of us would have dared. We all saw that something was wrong, but we pretended that everything was fine. You took a risk, and you should be thanked for that." These words were a breath of fresh air for Julian. They reminded him that his actions mattered, even if they were not publicly recognized. Gradually, he began to feel that the burden of fear and suspicion was diminishing. But he could not completely forget about what had happened. Every time he passed by the Ryders' empty house, he remembered their smiles, their lying words, and how they had almost realized their plan. At the end of the summer, Julian finished his book. He called it Those Who Hide Behind Walls. It became not only his personal story, but also a warning to all those who believe that evil is always somewhere far away. He hoped that his words would make people more attentive to what was happening around them. One day, on his way home from the publishing house, Julian saw a truck pull up outside the Ryder home. A new family was moving in. He watched the children playing in the yard and the parents unpacking. Julian had mixed feelings. He knew that he would always have anxiety in his heart. But this time, when he saw his new neighbors, for the first time in months, he felt hope instead of fear.